The first presentation will be delivered by Professor Khajida Mohammed. As we know, she is Associate Dean of EDI at the University of West of Scotland. She's a prominent anti-racist activist in Scotland and the co-founder and chair of the Scottish Association of Minority Ethnic Educators since 2013. Khadija is a multi-award-winning scholar who was elected as the first Muslim woman of color to hold the post of convener of the General Teaching Council for Scotland in 2022.
Thank you again for, I suppose, holding space for me at this BERA event. Learning about race equality, inequality in education, and the work we're doing in Scotland. And I guess I was speaking at a recent event, and it was really around, that in our current, I guess, sort of educational landscape, there's borders. Borders are not only, I would say, fences or checkpoints. They're absolutely embedded within our classrooms, our institutions, and conversations we are told not to have often. And I suppose a lot of the sort of barriers and borders that we face manifest as silences. And so with so much uncertainty across the globe, it's so important for us as educators, particularly teacher educators, to engage with this uncertainty. And the biggest thing for me really here is the myth busting, because oftentimes I come across this well-worn myth that racism doesn't exist here in Scotland. We are Jock Tamson's bears. It's often used to imply inclusivity. But what it actually does, I guess, is mask deep inequalities. And, the work of some of our Scottish colleagues, Davidson and his colleagues at the University of Glasgow, we must ask whose comfort does this work protect and whose experience does it render invisible? To say there is no racism here is not only untrue, it is harmful. And it actually also allows our institutions to overlook the very people most impacted by racism. And I think that's something that we need to be holding at the forefront of our conversations. Naming racism in Scottish education is something that we absolutely had to grapple with over the last, I suppose, few decades. But this idea around anti-racism is not just about condemning violence abroad. There's various elements to that. Sheikh Obayo died here in Scotland, and the justice system still fails his family. When teachers responded with hostility to Black Lives Matter, when they said all lives matter without understanding the context, it revealed how poorly we have equipped educators to understand racism. It's not just a personal insult. It is institutional, it is cultural, it is systemic, and it absolutely thrives in silence. And, I suppose we're currently wrestling with some explosive geopolitical, spaces where political leaders have legitimised, I guess, the diminishment of debate, dismissed people with opposing views as bigots, shut down informed arguments. And in a time when you can only be one thing or another, for or against, nothing quite sums up that willful ignorance, I guess, that's playing out. Political dissent is repressed, political language is policed. And in a recent article in The Guardian, I'm trying to remember the author's name, I have to remember the name, Mustafa Bayoumi, on the 6th of July, he talked about, the destruction of Palestine is breaking the world. I would argue that the world is on its knees. We're living in a new era of lawlessness, and this is not about the lack of law, it's about remaking the law. What Trump and leaders like him seek is not so much to destroy the law as to colonise it and to determine the parameters and serve their interests. A sort of local aspect from Scotland, we had thousands of letters from children and young people. So about 2,000 young people sent letters into our Deputy First Minister telling them about the experiences, the racism that they're experiencing in their schools across Scotland. And that really sparked a conversation with key stakeholders and leaders in education to say something needs to be done here. And in the face of that, there was also my research around the lived experiences of teachers of colour. And that study really took me into a space where I started to think about representation matters. You know, in Scotland, there are teachers of colour represent 1.8% of the workforce. And you break that down, I think it's around 2.3% secondary, 1.9% primary. I'm not sure if my figures are exact, so forgive me. But yet too many BME educators in Scotland work in what Rita Coley will refer to as hostile racial climates. They face peer racism, because in the conversations we were having, we talked very comfortably about children being racist to children, or children being racist to their teacher, or a teacher being racist to a child. But the elephant in the staff room was the racism that a teacher was experiencing from a fellow colleague. So they face a system that demands their labour but refuses their leadership. We do not have, I think, 0.1% of our teachers of colour are in leadership positions. And, you know, could be used as a really powerful tool, but only if it's used effectively. And I'll say a wee bit about that later. I mean, we've currently got a fantastic network called the Anti-Racism in Teacher Education Network, so our Right Network, where we've got members of all of our 11 teacher education providers. So in Scotland, we've got 19 universities, of which 11 of them provide teacher education programmes. So we have all of them as part of this network, working their way through the framework and creating action plans for their own institutions in terms of how they are working through the framework, and beginning to think about the change that needs to happen. There's something really important for us to begin to grapple with that space. And in some shape or form, the framework kind of addresses that in many ways. So, you know, in teacher education, we can see quite clearly here that there were ongoing challenges around, we had this very soft approach, I would argue, to what I'm referring to as multiculturalism. My own experience decades ago within ITE, my current experience in teaching ITE students was very much about where do we talk about racism, anti-racist practice, decolonising praxis, and it was very much in certain particular pockets. We talked about diversity and difference, didn't really talk about specifically around anti-racist practice. And there was some resistance there as well in terms of resistance by our students, but even so from some of our own teacher education colleagues, ignoring issues of racism, power and whiteness within teacher education, within education more broadly. Actually, I'd written a piece for the Runnymede Trust in 2020 where I'm arguing that whiteness and racism are conversations that are missing within Scottish education. And we've come some way since then, where we boldly mention that terminology. We talk openly about critical race theory, but that lack of diverse recruitment is still very much an issue here in Scotland to challenge some of those stereotypes. But for me, this is really close to my heart in terms of the racial literacy and teacher educators, you know, and it's, for me, it's an essential part of the component, not an optional part of it. How racially literate are we truly? And what it means for us is that the naming and the framing and actually really addressing racism in all its forms. It's also thinking about how we understand the ways that race intersects with gender, class, and the multiple intersecting identities in those spaces, and how it begins to shape our worldview. And I often am in conversations where there's a real defensiveness when whiteness is mentioned. And I remember a colleague saying to me, "Oh my goodness, I'm so pleased that you've mentioned, whiteness and fragility within the framework." And I think it's really important for us to push through some of that discomfort, and the argument, that a leader, a teacher educator, a teacher who can really deconstruct some of that is far better positioned to see perhaps why some of our pedagogical and curricular patterns might not be fit for purpose. And this is where that change begins. And this is where I think that leadership begins in that space. I'll move along. I'm just conscious of time. I don't want to spend. I know you've got a great presentation from Nuvan waiting after me. So this idea of teacher identity and positionality again features very strongly in the framework, because of course we know, colleagues, that identity is not fixed and we all hold multiple shifting identities. I'm not only a teacher or only a woman, I am all of these things at once, and so are our students. And students and educators should engage with racial identity development frameworks, really helping us to define ourselves, connect with one another, and organise on behalf of our shared interests. And for me, I think it really helps to generate solidarity when we support teachers to explore their positionality, their place in systems of power and identity, that we support authentic teaching. We allow them to bring their whole selves into the classroom, into our spaces, and that in turn allows our young people to do the same.